Selamat
Ya.
datang teman-teman sekalian. Sekarang sudah jam 3. Selamat datang Pak Hab dari Rotterdam, Pak Sugiarto sebagai pembicara bersama Pak Hab, Mas Yunanto dari Surakarta Heritage Society. Kita mulai acara ini. Saya membuka, saya sebagai pembuka seperti MC. Serangkaian seminar ini bertemakan cagar budaya dalam perspektif kebangsaan yang akan berisi 5 seminar dan 1 lokakarya. Dan ini seminar yang kedua, judulnya adalah Arsitektur dan Tata Kota Indonesia tahun 1870 sampai 1970 dalam data dan ahli fungsi bangunan heritage. Jadi judul ini sesuai dengan judul atau isi buku dari hasil penelitian Pak Hab dari Rotterdam. Dengan nanti akan direspon oleh Pak Sugiarto, akan berbicara tentang penyelamatan heritage oleh arsitektur di Indonesia. Penyelamatan heritage di Indonesia saya kira belum berusia lama ya. 10-15 tahun banyak sekali heritage yang merupakan cagar budaya dihancurkan dan dibangun menjadi bangunan baru. Kita hanya punya foto dan kita kehilangan artefak penting di dalam kita masa lalu, bagaimana masa lalu itu ada dan membentuk sebuah komunitas, membentuk bangsa. Untung saja muncul banyak pemerhati, aktivis, akademisi yang menyuarakan penyelamatan heritage. Pemainnya pada awalnya paling banyak adalah arsitektur, dan kemudian banyak antropolog, sosiolog, sejarawan, masyarakat, kemudian pemerintah merespon, dan sekarang kita punya undang-undang undang-undang pemajuan kebudayaan tahun 2017 yang berisi tentang penyelamatan heritage di Indonesia. Jadi ini semacam gerakan yang memerlukan 3 komponen, yaitu gerakan masyarakat, gerakan akademisi, dan kemudian respon pemerintah. Ketiga-tiganya tidak bisa dilepaskan di dalam gerakan penyelamatan heritage yang bendawi maupun yang non-bendawi. Karena itu di dalam perayaan 75 tahun kemerdekaan, kita mengambil tema cagar budaya dalam kaitannya dengan kebangsaan, di mana 3 organisasi yang berkolaborasi memperingati 75 tahun kemerdekaan dalam kaitannya dengan cagar budaya adalah Himpunan Kerabat Mangkunegaran, di mana Mangkunegaran punya warisan heritage yang begitu kaya, ada musik, tarian, gedung, dan kebudayaan dan sebagainya. Dan kemudian berkolaborasi dengan Surakarta Heritage Society, di mana saya dari Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana, Biro Pengembangan dan Mobilisasi Sumber Daya, yang menginisiasi kegiatan ini. Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana tidak punya jurusan yang terkait langsung dengan heritage seperti arsitektur dan yang lain. Tapi Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana punya jurusan destinasi pariwisata dan juga pendidikan sejarah. Lulusan-lulusan ini diharapkan bisa berbicara kalau sebagai guide, sebagai guru sejarah, sebagai penulis buku sejarah dan sebagainya, itu berbicara berdasarkan fakta, data. Itu penting. Karena konstruksi yang salah akan membelokkan perjalanan bangsa ini ke arah yang salah juga. Karena itu Satya Wacana punya kepentingan kaitannya dengan heritage. Ini dikaitkan dengan nation building. Jadi kami peduli pada studi-studi dan kajian-kajian tidak hanya sebagai bangunan, tapi juga non bangunan yang disebut heritage non bendawi. Jadi saya kira dari masa kolonial ini kita akan melihat bagaimana masa kolonial itu sangat serius di dalam membangun tata kotanya, aliran bangunannya nampak dan kemudian meninggalkan satu bangunan yang indah. Pertanyaannya adalah kenapa bangunan di masa kemerdekaan ini, mohon maaf dalam perspektif saya, kurang menampakkan identitas. Nah, ini pembukaannya dan mari kita sekarang berdiri mendengarkan Indonesia Raya. Silakan. Ya, Bapak Momi hadir. Herman, Bapak Momi sudah datang belum? Halo?
Sepertinya belum, Ibu.
Oh ya, kalau belum, sekarang kita memasuki presentasi utama karena materinya banyak sekali. Saya persilahkan Mas Tito Satrio sebagai moderator. Ia adalah seorang arsitektur yang telah melalang buana di Indonesia dan luar negeri. Dan ia juga menjadi guru destinasi pariwisata Universitas Kristen Satyawatana. Silakan Mas Tito untuk memimpin acara diskusi ini.
Halo semuanya, maaf saya lupa untuk unmute. Selamat sore semuanya, senang berjumpa dengan Bapak Ibu sekalian dalam seminar yang berjudul Arsitektur dan Tata Kota di Indonesia tahun 1870 sampai dengan 1970 dalam data dan alih fungsi bangunan. Heritage kali ini sedang menjadi topik yang hangat untuk dibicarakan. Wisata heritage adalah salah satunya. Pembicaraan tentang heritage menjadi cukup menarik karena selalu berkaitan dengan konservasi, restorasi, dan sejarah bagaimana heritage dibangun. Banyak sekali arsitek dari Belanda dan Indonesia yang berperan pada saat itu. Sebut saja Schumacher, Thomas Karsten, Silaban, dan lain-lain sebagainya, sangat banyak. Peninggalan budaya tersebut selayaknya didokumentasikan dengan baik. Keterkaitan multi pihak dalam pendokumentasian ini akan sangat berpengaruh dalam pelestarian. Terutama dari pihak pemerintah, seperti yang disebutkan BST, dari akademisi, dari asosiasi profesi, bahkan komunitas. Saya akan mengutip beberapa paragraf dari halaman depan buku yang ditulis Pak Hab. Interest in the common architectural and urban, especially in 1900 period, is strongly increased. In the Netherlands, researchers and interested parties involved from different disciplines engage in study, research and description of the development within architecture and urban planning in Indonesia, in particular with the former Dutch East India, formed at the end of 1986, and the Working Group Architecture and Urban Planning in Indonesia, atau ARSI. ARSI has been part of the cultural history of the Dutch Overseas Foundation, or CNO. Since 1989, not only aims to be a platform for information exchange, but also to stimulate study and research and to publicize the result thereof. At the end of September 1988, the seminar entitled Change and Heritage in Indonesia Cities was organized by the Ikatan Arsitek Indonesia and the Dutch counterpart, the Royal Society for the Promotion of Architecture Association of Dutch Architect, or BNA. The Dutch participated in addition to ARSI and the BNA, the Rijksdienst for the Historic Preservation and Delft University of Technology. On the occasion of this seminar, ARSI member Dr. Anders Hab Akihari commissioned the National Agency for the Preservation of Monuments has compiled a synopsis entitled Architecture and Urban Planning Indonesia 1870 until 1970. Peran IAI dan ARSI pada seminar tahun 1988 tersebut setidaknya memberi gambaran relasi antara asosiasi yang telah terbentuk antara Indonesia dan Belanda. Peneliti yang bergerak secara mandiri ataupun akademisi mempunyai peran yang cukup signifikan dalam pelestarian cagar budaya yang tangible ini. Nah, bagian yang menarik untuk dicermati dan mungkin direplikasi adalah cara penggalian data, di mana apabila dilakukan secara detail akan lebih mempertajam data dan sejarah yang ada di belakang bangunan-bangunan heritage tersebut. Untuk tidak membuang waktu dalam seminar yang menarik ini, telah hadir dua narasumber, yaitu narasumber pertama adalah Bapak Hab Akihari. Are you Mr. Hab? Pleased to meet you in this lovely afternoon.
Good morning.
Okay, sorry. Good morning. Good morning. In Indonesia, we have afternoon.
I know.
Okay. Please allow me to read your CV. Then the audience will know you better.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, thank you. Hab Akihari, freelance art and architecture historian, researcher, writer, and exhibition maker dari tahun 1983 sampai sekarang, 37 tahun. Research into shared heritage or Dutch colonial architecture and town planning in Indonesia. Giving lectures about shared heritage and history of architecture in Indonesia and the Netherlands. Education, University of Amsterdam, doctoral master, History of Architecture as a major, 1981 sampai dengan 1986. Leiden University, doctoral masters, bahasa Indonesia sebagai minor ya, 1985 sampai 1986 juga. University of Amsterdam, doctoral master, History of Art Painting, 17 century sampai 19 century minor, tahun 1981 sampai 1986. Universiteit van Amsterdam, doctoral master, Kunst has Hidenis, History of Art 1976-1986. Dan terakhir di Institut Teknologi Bandung atau ITB, jurusan arsitektur, prodi arsitektur 1984-1985. Mr. Hab, I have read your book entitled Architecture and State Law in Indonesia 1870 till 1970. It's a very interesting book about heritage Indonesia. Well, many foreign names involved to develop Indonesia-related building and urban planning at that time. And as I would like to inform you that the biggest part of our audience might be students. I hope that in 30 minutes further, you could share your experience for digging and looking for data behind your research related heritage Indonesia.
Okay, thank you.
Please. Well, you are waiting for your interesting presentation after I introduce the second speaker. Baiklah, setelah Pak Hab, saya perkenalkan narasumber kedua, yaitu Bapak Sugiarto IAI. Beliau adalah seorang arsitek profesional. Selamat sore, Pak Giarto.
Selamat sore, semangat sore.
Semangat sore. Yang didapuk menjadi Ketua Ikatan Arsitek Indonesia. Perkenankan saya membacakan CV Pak Giarto ya. Pendidikan, Magister Teknik Arsitektur, Program Pasca Sarjana Universitas Diponegoro atau UNDIP, Program Studi Arsitektur tahun 2011. Master of Art, Program Studi Christian Leadership, Sekolah Tinggi Teologi International Harvest, STTIH, Semarang, lulus Agustus 2004. Sarjana Teknik Fakultas Teknik Arsitektur, Universitas Katolik Sugio Pranoto, Semarang, atau UNIKA, lulus Februari tahun 1998. Keorganisasian, beliau adalah Ketua IAI Provinsi Jawa Tengah periode 2017 sampai 2020. Jadi sekarang beliau masih menjabat sebagai Ketua IAI. Pengurus IAI Daerah Jawa Tengah bidang sayembara dan penghargaan periode 2014 sampai 2017. Saya akan bacakan mundur ke belakang. Pengurus IAI Daerah Jawa Tengah anggota Badan Pendidikan Arsitektur periode 2008 sampai 2011. Dosen Stekom 2008 sampai dengan sekarang. Direktur Utama PT Narwastu Desain Arsitek 2009 sampai dengan sekarang. General Manager PT Bumi Anugrah Inti Surya 2015 sampai dengan sekarang. General Manager PT Anugrah Damelan Utama 2012 sampai dengan sekarang. Pendiri komunitas Sketsa Arsi Skatur Indonesia tahun 2012 dan Ketua Komunitas Arsi Skatur Indonesia 2012 sampai dengan 2014. Oke, untuk tidak membuang waktu, karena waktu kita cukup terbatas, kita sudah habis 18 menit. Presentasi pertama tentang digging data di balik research akan dipresentasikan oleh Pak Hab. Mr. Hab,
Yes.
your turn to start your presentation. The
Okay.
stage is yours. Alsjeblieft.
Thank you. I have a presentation, a PowerPoint, and I'm trying to start it up. Just hoping it will work. Can you see anything?
Yeah, I see this.
Yes, you can see
It's
it.
perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
I have a lot of slides, and first of all, you can see the presentation online. The link will be given further on in the presentation. Let me start because I only have 30 minutes, all right?
Okay.
Okay. Second slide. My name is Huip Akihari. Akihari comes from Maluku.
Oh.
Yeah, that's why I'm always in Indonesia because of family ties.
Yeah.
This is the first book I made, Architectuur en Stedenbouw in Indonesia, 1870-1970. It's written in Dutch. After a few years, it was translated in Bahasa Indonesia by Pa Han Awal.
Oh.
He's famous, the old Indonesian architect. He passed away last year, but he made a nice translation of the book. Unfortunately, it's not published yet. Okay, we are talking about end of the 70s, beginning 80s, when I started the research into the architecture, the colonial architecture of Indonesia. At that time, we had no publications, no overviews of our colonial times in Indonesia, no overview of the Dutch colonial architecture. So I was the first in Holland to start this kind of research. We had a few publications. I want to show you some. One is this one. It's written by two Dutch military engineers. Lakenveld and Brox are their names, and it was published in 1864. 1864. It's a very long time ago. And they wrote about how to build in Indonesia, how to build in the colony, especially for engineers. It was a kind of model book. For instance, if you see this kind of, it says public buildings and the interiors. It's about the pakhuizen means the factories for the sugar, for the coffee, for the mines, etc., etc. And so they described all kinds of buildings. And they had also a big second volume with plates. Unfortunately, I don't have that one, but it's still available in Dutch libraries. Another very important publication at that time, it was this one from Mr. Tillema. He was an apothecarian in Semarang, and he wrote about health and about sanitation in the Indonesian cities, especially in the kampungs. And you see the year, it's 1913. So topics like kampung improvement were very important for him. And in the book, you will see the first pictures of buildings from the time. So these were my kind of sources to start the investigation, to start the research. A famous Dutch architect, Mr. Berlage, traveled in 1923 to Indonesia. And he wrote about it. It was a diary. It was published in 1931. And after returning to Holland, he gave lectures about, of course, the traditional architecture, Javanese temples, the temple on Bali, and so forth and so forth. And he also made drawings, and a few drawings were published, like this one. Famous drawings made by the famous Berlage. Also, this one is still existing. It's in Solo. The Chinese scholars, maybe you can recognize this. Other publications at that time, around the 1980s, we had monographies of cities like Batavia. Batavia als handelsindustrie en woonstad. Also about a book about Kebangsaan, Surabaya, but also magazines published around 1900 up till 1930, like the Indisch Bouwkundig Tijdschrift, The Engineer, and the Waterstaatsingenieur. Dutch publications, Dutch magazines published for engineers about, of course, how to build in Indonesia. But also nice magazines like this one, Nederlands India, Oud en Nieuw. It was published by the Dutch architect Eduard Cuypers. And of course, he published about his own buildings, which he built in Indonesia. This one is the very first edition, very first issue of January 1916. It's very nice publication. At that time, at the end of the 1970s, there was a book published in Holland, translated into Dutch by the Italian writer Fanelli, and he published about modern architecture in Holland. But what is so specific about this book? It had not only a story about the development of architecture in Holland, but it also had a list of architects with their data, biodata, their list of works, and by bibliography. And this book was the model for my book, which was first published in 1988 at the seminar Change and Heritage in Indonesian Cities. It was just very first overview of the colonial architecture in this period, 1870, 1970. 2 years ago, two years later, in 1990, there was a new edition, which has become famous in Indonesia, with this title, Architectuur en Stedenbouw in Indonesia, 1870-1970. It has a short introduction to the history of Dutch colonial architecture and town planning. It has also, like Fanelli, a list of architects with their bibliography. And the reason for doing was it has to be a first stepping stone to do further research. Research not only in Holland, but also in Indonesia. And at that time, we had, of course, also the so-called working group in Holland, ARSI, Architectuur Stedenbouw in Indonesia. So we were very active, and we did quite some publications. Well, in the book, you will see a few chapters about the short history of Indonesia, about the architecture history and development in Indonesia, and also the list, which was very important. If you look at the book, I won't tell much about the book. You can read the book. It's sold out in Holland. Sometimes you can find a copy on Amazon or on eBay. But I have given a copy, PDF, online, so you can check it later and you can download the book itself. So that's my, it's a copy, so everyone can read the book, but it is, of course, in Dutch, but you can have a copy in PDF. What is important about the short history of the colonial architecture in Holland? It is only 150 years. It starts around 1814, when Holland gets all his colonies back, including the Dutch Indies. 1870 is a year which is very important for the colony Dutch India Belanda, because there were two laws. One was the sugar law, and one was the agricultural law. Oh. It meant one was the ending of the so-called cultuurstelsel, which is a kind of system of forced labor and forced growing of goods. And the second one was the opening up of the colony for private enterprises, for private capital. Before that, the government, the Dutch government, the Dutch colonial government, had everything in hand, also the economics. What had meant is that after 1870, many factories were built, many companies came to Indonesia to work to develop the colony. There was such an influx of people into the colony that after 1903, they had to decide that the local government has to be decentralized into, given to cities, like, for instance, Batavia, like, for instance, Bandung, like, for instance, Semarang and Surabaya. And they were forming stadsgemeenten, independent stadsgemeenten, independent municipalities, according Dutch model. No. So in between 1910 and 1942, we only are talking about 30 years. But this is the time that the colony was developed. If we say in Holland, tempo dulu, we're just meaning about this 3 decades. And in those 3 decades, the heritage, the Dutch colonial architecture heritage was formed. So the main part is always dating from that period, 1900, 1942. Of course, 1942, it was the end. Japanese, Second World War, 1945, August 17, independence, Republic Indonesia, and so on and so on. In 1957, the Dutch had to leave. Those are important data, but we are only talking about 150 years. Well, I have made a few slides, but I won't tell it. You can see it later on your own by checking the PowerPoint yourself online. I just browse it. It's about the story about the 19th century, what happened in Indonesia, just in an oversight. You see some famous buildings. You probably will know and recognize how they look like. It's in Batavia, etc., etc. Most interesting architecture for me are these kinds of buildings that you see here on the slide. The upper is in Surabaya. It's 19th century architecture. So most of the colonial architecture from the period 1900-1942 have been inventorized, have been documented well. But apart from the 19th century, like this kind of architecture, which has, of course, Dutch influence or Western influence, is also very interesting to look at. You see many styles combined into one building. For instance, the right picture, you can see Chinese influences with the upper floor, which is opened, etc., etc. But you see also Dutch columns in the ground floor. The picture on the left under is in, if I remember well, this is Jogja. Also different styles. Well, during the 19th century, we see kind of developments, and of course, in the 20th century, the influx of people, also the influx of well-trained architects, trained at the university in Delft, trained at the Technische Hogeschool. And they came between 1905 and 1910, let's say, probably 50 engineers came in that period to Indonesia. Figures, they were very young, just studied at the TU in Delft, and then they came for their first job in Indonesia. Later, they became very important architects. I have more slides, the growth of Bandung, which is, of course, interesting, but maybe not relevant for now. If you look at the building of architecture, there were, of course, after 1900, private architects, and the government was building. And the government, the Dutch government, had an own department, the Departement Burgerlijke Openbare, which is the Departement Pekerjaan Umum. And they founded a special bouwkundig bureau, a special bureau which was had to design all kinds of governmental buildings, schools, houses, offices, etc., etc. Many, and they were standardized because of the quantity of buildings. So if you look at schools nowadays in Indonesia, most of the schools were designed by the Dutch BOW. Very important department. You see here, Regeringsalmanak 1913, which is a quite good source. Well, some buildings which were made in the first decade of the 20th century, famous buildings, like for instance, this one, the Office of the Nil made by Thomas Karsten in 1916. And here you see the architectural development and design practice in styles, as we see. I'm an art historian, I'm an architecture historian, so I'm not designing, but I'm, as an historian, looking at buildings and trying to understand and trying to describe them. That's my task. And also my task is to document buildings. So I'm always looking at data buildings. What is it? Who made it? Where is it? Location? When was it designed or built? And the reason why. So the 5 W's, I will come back to that later on. Famous architects came. Walt Schoenmaker, many nice buildings, very known now. You can read in the book. McLean Pont, one of my favorites. Because one of the most beautiful buildings ever seen is the ITB in Bandung. Very nice building, and you should be proud that you have such a building in Indonesia. Really, really, it's one of the world monuments, I guess.
Indeed.
So this is Bandung with different minor architects, less known, but also very nice buildings like this one in Gerber. Albers, he was a funny architect. He was Hollywood style architect with beautiful buildings like this one. Streamlined. Nice little station for the first planes, Vliegsstation Andir. And it was made by BOW, an architect, Mr. Breuning. After the war, we had, as we call it in Holland, the wederopbouw, the rebuilding, by the first generation of Indonesian architects, trained at ITB or trained at the TU Delft, and they designed it with a few Dutch architects who left behind, who stayed in Indonesia. One of the first projects was, of course, Kebangsaan Baru in Jakarta. 1957, repatriation of Dutch architects. Of course, first Indonesian architects like Silaban, who was also working in Bogor. He made some remarkable buildings. And one who stayed very long was Mr. Gmeling, with some beautiful buildings as like this one in Bandung and this one in Jakarta. Okay, let's go back to research, to the present situation. In the 1980s, there was no interest in Indonesia about Dutch colonial architecture. Only a few architects like Adi Mursid, like Vastu Praganta, like Pahanawal, and a few professors at universities who were supporting me and our group. That's why also the seminar in 1988, Change and Heritage in Indonesian Cities. Local heritage societies or clubs, like for instance, Surakarta Heritage Society, they always, they started making inventories and trying to document the buildings. And if they have the data, trying to do further research. That's the first steps you have to do, because this is the start. If you're talking about taking care of your heritage, it starts with making inventories. starting with documentation of the building, starting to find the data about the buildings, and starting to find data about who was designing those kind of buildings. And this is the first step, which is my part. I'm good in this. So if that's why I always was asked to help people to start their research. And research is always finding basic metadata of study objects, in this case, buildings. And of course, again, the 5 W's. What? Name of the object. Who? Designer, builder, contractor, commissioner. Where? The location. When? Year of design. Why? Circumstance, reason why it was built. And you need to find data. You need to find sources. You need to use sources. And you have, of course, a difference in the sources, like primary and secondary sources. Well, there is a toolkit made for doing research in Indonesia on the specific topic of architectural history and town planning. It was issued by the Dutch Department of the National Archive and RCA, which is a Dutch organization which is related to the Ministry of Welfare and Culture. And they organized in 2014 the first workshop, Collecting and Connecting, meaning to find out how to use sources in Indonesia as well in Indonesia. And the outcome of this workshop was a tool with the name Digging for Data, trying to find data, mencari data. An Indonesian translation was published in 2017. So this publication you also can find on the internet folder, and I will give you the link later on. And you can download it and you can read this nice tool, Digging for Data. In the last few years, I have been given workshops in Indonesia about digging for data. Well attended and with a lot of people to participate. In this toolkit, Digging for Data, we try to explain in 6 steps how to do research, how to find those first data which are so important. And the 6 steps, in short, are defining your research question, which is very important. What are you looking for? Second step is identifying collections and sources, either in Holland or in Indonesia. And the next step is what collections and sources to use and why. 4th step is how to use the sources. The 5th step is interpreting the sources. And 6th is filling and referencing sources and data. You can read it by yourself. It's too much time. It takes too much time to explain every step in depth. Okay. But you have to do your first reading about how to do it. But you can, it's in Bahasa Indonesia, mencari data. In short, step 1, define your research question, examining the object, collecting the 5 W's, what, who, where, when, why. Very first step, very important. Then, this can be read also in the book. You have to, if you have put up a question of your research, you have to connect to a relevant source. This is very important. This is also kind of difficult how to do it, but it is explained in the book. Of course, there are a difference between primary and secondary sources. And they are as well in Indonesia as in Holland. For you in Indonesia, you don't have to come to Holland anymore. It's very simple now because most of the sources in Holland are digitized. and accessible through the internet. So you can sit and relax at home, log in, use your computer and go to the Dutch archives or Dutch databases, etc., etc. Just from your own chair in your room, you can find a lot of data. Now, it's of course, sources are essential in historical research, etc. What collection source to use? Well, just read it later. How to use, differentiate between secondary and primary sources. Now, secondary sources are by definition always someone's interpretation of the original sources. So if someone writes about a first book or a first building, then it's a secondary source. The first primary source is, for instance, a picture of the building, just made after completion. Or a primary source is also usual, the archive. But how to use sources, you can see, you can read it later on. It is, how much time do I have?
You still have a lot of time, no worries.
Okay. Well, then I will go back to, for instance, how to use the sources. If you have a specific question, research question, and you have connected to a specific source. Let's say if you want to do something about town planning, the first primary source is always using maps, contemporary maps. There are a lot of maps of Indonesian cities, especially maps from the 1900s and onwards. You can look into those maps, but you have to know where to find those maps. We have made inventories where to find those maps. If you, let's say, you want to know about a certain area in a specific city and you want to know the history of that area, and you have to use maps, probably, and that's the how to use the 4 sources, you have 4 options. The information found in your source, in the map, answer your research question. So you can take the data. The info found is just partially related to your research. Then you have to make a decision, interpret the info given. The third option is there is no useful information, but it leads you, it gives you some clues to other possible options or leads to other sources. The fourth option, it has no relation to your research question. Skip it, leave it. Okay. That's how you have to work systematically. Sometimes it's so interesting, but you have to be very disciplined not to read. Otherwise, you lose yourself in your research. And then, of course, interpretation of sources. What will you do with the information found? Well, in the digging for data, everything is explained. Also, step 6, how to document, how to register the found data. Because you also have to give reference. This is important in historical research. You have to write something, about a building or about an architect, and you have found data. But if you want to publish, you have to give reference. Where did you find the information? Using footnotes, using notes to say, this is my source. And the way how you do this is explained in step 6, filing and referencing sources and data. It's important. Example 1, for instance, reference to a book with 1 author and 1 editor. Examples are given how to do it correctly by international standards, which is then for other interpreters, for other researchers, a good source. Everyone can say, oh, this is a good source because he gave a reference where he found that information. All right, this is the link of the online folder. And on the online folder, you will find this PowerPoint, which I'm presenting. You will find a PDF of the digital tool Mencari Data. You will find the book Architectuur en Stedenbouw in Indonesia. And you will find, and this is very important, a list of sources, sumber online. And they are just checked because, as you know, links online can be changed very, very rapidly, especially Indonesian. Sometimes they don't work. So you have to check them every once in a while. I hope they will work. Yesterday I did a check and they were working, but it can change, I don't know. But the Dutch are still working, although sometimes they change as well. But the Sumber Online are an important starting point for further research for you. As you go online using this link, which I gave to you, tiny URL, seminar UKSW 2908, which is the date of today, you will find something like this, a map on the OneDrive with the documents involved. And you just click on it and they will pop up. The Sumber Online is also published in the publication Mencari Data, but these are old data. So use the new list of the list of the online sources. Well, I give you a few examples of the very important or most important links to be used for your research. Leiden University just has made a reorganization of all their websites, but they have large quantities of information. The former institutes like KIT and KITLV, important Dutch institutes which are have large collections about Dutch colonial history, are now at the University of Leiden. So you have, if you use the link given on the actual list, you will find the Leiden University libraries. You will find also their digital collections with maps, with pictures, etc. Start with this, digital collections of Leiden University. The National Archive in The Hague is also digitized and online. You will find many, many archives about Indonesia, about companies, about cities, about everything. Just fill in what you are looking. If in this example you see the search term is Medan, Kota Medan, and you will see there are 126 archives at the National Archive with about Medan. We have 1,755 pictures related to Medan, no maps, and 17 indexes. So it's a good starting point also, National Archive. The National Library, the Koninklijke Bibliotheek, Royal Library in The Hague, also has been digitized. Books, magazines, articles, newspapers, everything you can find. Also many Indonesian magazines from the colonial period you will find here. Just use search terms, but be aware, take care of the spelling, the correct spelling. If you use the correct spelling, you will find many data. But it's all in Dutch. So this is also a hindrance, for instance, for many scholars and researchers. you need to know at least 100 or 150 Dutch words to go into these kinds of websites to use the website well. Names of cities which are written differently than present transcriptions. For instance, Bandung is pakai U, but in the Volksmond was pakai OE, for instance. Nederland, yes, SCH. No, these are examples which are important. Het Nieuwe Instituut is the Architecture Institute in Rotterdam. They have all the info about Dutch architects. And you will find here also a few Dutch Indonesian architects, their archives. Yeah? Mm-hmm. This is Beeldbank, means the image bank of RCE, the Rijksdienst Cultureel Erfgoed, which is the state institute for culture in Holland. And they have, of course, a department in Indonesia. So you will find also here documents, pictures about Indonesia. A very nice website is Colonial Architecture and Town Planning of the TU Delft repository. You will find here publications in PDF, and you can see those publications online.
Okay.
Stichting Bonas is a Dutch institute which publishes about Dutch architects, and they have also made publications about the Dutch Indonesian architects. Check the list. An international list is the Atlas of Mutual Heritage, and you will see here many documents, info about the Dutch colonial past, not only Indonesia, but also other parts in the world, like, for instance, Africa, Brazil, Japan, and in India. Pusat Documentasi Arsitektuur, which is the Indonesian Institute in Jakarta, a central institute. Their library is still working. Also, you can check online. We have Sejarah Nusantara, which is an Indonesian website. And also the National Library of Indonesia has an entrance to do some research. Images, you can see where to start in the Dutch collections, digital collections, Leiden University, Nationaal Archief. Now, they are for explained maps, for instance, with all the sources where you have to check first. Newspapers, Delft, which is the Royal Library, already mentioned. Sources related to architects, etc., 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 etc. And also an important source is the ARSIP in Jakarta. You can do research there. If you have the paperwork done well and you have the Surat Izin, then you can do research into the archives. And there's a lot of documents in the archives. And many are now digitized as well, but not put online yet. They are working on it. Right? They have a cooperation with the Dutch National Archive, and there are two major big digital machines who are scanners, and they can scan everything on big formats. So also Arsip Nasional di Jakarta is working very hard to digitize their collections. Mm-hmm. Well, okay. So far, I will leave the link, write it down, and check in, I would say. Okay, terima kasih. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for an interesting presentation by Mr. Hab. Well, we still have a second speaker. Maaf, kita masih ada satu speaker lagi, yaitu Ketua IAI Provinsi Jawa Tengah, Pak Sugiarto. Setelah selesai Pak Sugiarto, nanti kita sampai pada sesi tanya jawab. Jadi persiapkan apa yang ditanyakan kepada siapa sesuai format ya. Oke, Pak Sugiarto, the stage is yours. Silakan.
Oke, terima kasih. Oke. Oke, terima kasih Mas Tito. Selamat sore, salam sehat untuk semuanya.
Selamat sore, Mas.
Ya, sore ini saya terkagum-kagum dengan presentasi dari Mr. Hub yang luar biasa. Datanya luar biasa. Ini pasti sangat-sangat bermanfaat buat ini peserta. Nah, giliran saya, kalau tadi sudah sangat-sangat berat gitu, saya akan santai saja bicara yang tapi menyangkut tanggung jawab.
Itu bukan santai lagi, Pak.
Ya, di sini hadir saya lihat tadi teman-teman dari penggiat Heritage, ada Mas Adit, ada Pak Yunanto, yang beliau lebih ke pelaku. Nah, sore hari ini saya ditantang sama Mas Tito untuk bicara apa sih tanggung jawab PIAI dalam menjaga warisan budaya. Jadi saya tidak ahli sejarah, saya tidak ahli dalam heritage, tapi saya kebetulan di Jawa Tengah diberikan untuk jadi ketuanya arsitek Jawa Tengah, jadi saya harus bicara di sini. Nah, kita bicara tentang IAI, ya, itu Ikatan Arsitek Indonesia. Jadi banyak yang salah kadang-kadang jadi Ikatan Arsitektur Indonesia. Ini perlu diluruskan. Kemudian kita sebagai asosiasi profesi ya, kita di kumpulan arsitek-arsitek. Kemudian yang berkaitan dengan ini karena kita memiliki bidang pelestarian. Ini Mas Adit ada di sini dari pelestarian nasional. Tadi saya sudah menyapa. Kemudian kita punya undang-undang. Nah, berbicara tentang arsitek, tentu kita tidak terlepas dari hal-hal yang berkaitan dengan arsitektur, baik itu bangunan-bangunan heritage maupun bangunan-bangunan yang baru terutama. Nah, saya berbicara di ranah undang-undang. Jadi kalau berkaitan dengan pelestarian dan sebagainya, saat ini arsitek sudah punya undang-undang nomor 6 tahun 2017 yang baru. Jadi bahkan ini masih menunggu proses untuk keluarnya peraturan pemerintah yang lebih detail untuk kita laksanakan. Tetapi ada hal penting yang perlu kita ketahui bahwa di dalam undang-undang itu ada satu hal yang ini menjadi tugas, menjadi tanggung jawab arsitek. Nah, jadi kalau saya cuplik dulu di dalam tugas IAI, ya salah satunya ini organisasi profesi. Ini salah satunya di huruf G itu mengembangkan arsitektur dan melestarikan nilai budaya Indonesia. Nah, ini tentu berkaitan dengan apa yang menjadi tugas arsitek untuk bagaimana turut melestarikan budaya. Budaya itu sekian banyak, salah satunya adalah peninggalan budaya arsitektur yang tadi datanya yang luar biasa dimiliki oleh Mr. Hub. Tentu itu bukan kerja yang gampang, tapi kerja keras yang luar biasa. Dan saya yakin teman-teman di sini pada ngiler nih. melihat data yang dipunyai Pak Abi ini, bagaimana cara mendapatkan, bagaimana cara memiliki. Karena itu akan menjadi referensi yang luar biasa, terutama teman-teman pelaku-pelaku pelestari. Nah, saya sangat concern pada tugas saya saat ini di IAI, tentu turut membina anggota di dalam mengembangkan arsitektur dan melestarikan nilai budaya Indonesia ini, sangat kami fokuskan, sehingga ini memberikan banyak peluang teman-teman arsitek di Jawa Tengah khususnya, tapi secara nasional kita bergandeng tangan untuk melakukan itu. Kemudian bicara arsitek, saya mengutip satu dari Romo Mangun ini ada beberapa, tapi yang ini saya tertarik sekali bahwa arsitek adalah mereka yang mampu melakukan peran dalam proses kreatif menuju terwujudnya tata ruang dan tata masa dalam rangka pengadaan wadah kehidupan yang secara kualitatif memenuhi dimensi-dimensi tata nilai yang hidup di dalam masyarakat, tata ekologi, serta tata lembaga dan peranata. Ketika kita bicara budaya, tentu ini tidak lepas dari proses yang luar biasa. Dahulu para arsitek-arsitek yang saat ini meninggalkan jejak, meninggalkan budaya, meninggalkan bangunan-bangunan bersejarah itu, ini dipegang teguh sehingga sampai saat ini semuanya itu masih ada dan utuh di dalam kehidupan kita. Yang mereka juga memenuhi dimensi-dimensi tata nilai, tata ekologi, dan tata lembaga. Pasti saat ini tata nilai dan tata ekologi itu masih bertahan sampai sekarang, dan ini menjadi budaya, sehingga di dalam berarsitektur sebagai profesi arsitek ini harus dipegang teguh. Nah, di Undang-Undang Nomor 6 Tahun 2017 tentang arsitek, di bab 3 pasal 4 ayat 2C, jadi salah satu tugas arsitek itu adalah pelestarian bangunan gedung dan lingkungannya. Artinya bahwa IAI punya tanggung jawab untuk menyiapkan teman-teman arsitek ini untuk, kalau yang senior-senior sudah begitu banyak, karena saya lihat saya berkumpul begitu banyak teman-teman yang sangat concern, peduli dengan bangunan-bangunan cagar budaya, warisan budaya kita, tetapi kita sebagai generasi muda juga harus menyiapkan generasi penerus agar semuanya bisa berkelanjutan. Jadi pelestarian bangunan gedung dan lingkup itu merupakan pelayanan praktek arsitek. Jadi kalau kita bicara lingkup pelayanan arsitek, pelayanan utama itu salah satunya adalah pelestarian gedung dan lingkungannya. Jadi kemudian ada layanan yang bersama profesi. Kalau tadi disampaikan bahwa di dalam pelestarian bangunan ini sekarang ini bukan hanya arsitek saja, tetapi dari beberapa ilmu ya, sekarang arkeologi juga terlibat, bahkan karena itu sudah menyangkut peninggalan bangunan-bangunan yang kuno, arkeologi, kemudian antropologi berkaitan dengan perilaku manusia dan sebagainya. Ini menjadi layanan yang bisa kita lakukan bersama arsitek. Tetapi di sini menurut saya arsitek memegang peranan penting. Yang hadir di sini mungkin banyak yang bukan arsitek juga, tetapi ini bukan kita sok pinter gitu, tapi ini adalah menjadi tugas penting arsitek untuk melakukan apa yang menjadi marwah daripada undang-undang dan tugas kita sebagai arsitek untuk masyarakat. Nah, hal-hal yang penting, jadi kalau saya ditanyakan bagaimana sih implementasi dan tanggung jawab IAI terhadap bangunan atau warisan budaya, kami melakukan banyak hal di dalam kegiatan-kegiatan di sepanjang perjalanan organisasi. Jadi yang pertama, salah satu adalah meningkatkan kesadaran di kalangan arsitek untuk mencintai dan memelihara warisan budaya berupa kawasan dan bangunan bersejarah atau bernilai arsitektur tinggi. Ini mesti kesadaran di kalangan arsitek ini harus ditumbuhkan, dipupuk, sehingga mungkin tidak semua arsitek akan tertarik untuk mengurusi atau tertarik untuk berkecimpung dengan bangunan-bangunan kuno, tetapi kesadaran ini harus ditekankan atau ditingkatkan untuk kepedulian terhadap bangunan-bangunan kuno. Meningkatkan kemampuan serta penguasaan teknis terhadap jenis-jenis tindakan pemugaran kawasan atau bangunan, terutama terhadap bangunan-bangunan yang ada. Jadi kalau saat ini, nanti saya akan beri contoh di Semarang itu banyak sekali kita kaya akan bangunan-bangunan heritage dan sudah banyak yang dilakukan revitalisasi, direnovasi dan diubah fungsi, tetapi bagaimana meningkatkan kemampuan serta penguasaan teknik terhadap jenis-jenis tindakan pemugaran ini penting. Makanya beberapa kali bahkan secara periode IAI Jawa Tengah tetap melakukan workshop, melakukan pelatihan untuk memberikan pengetahuan tentang ini kepada arsitek-arsitek muda kita. Ya, melakukan penelitian serta dokumentasi atas kawasan atau bangunan yang perlu dilestarikan ini menjadi bagian yang penting dan sudah banyak dilakukan, tetapi kami juga tetap menyiapkan atau melakukan ini untuk membekali teman-teman arsitek muda untuk bisa ambil bagian di dalam hal ini. Yang penting adalah karena kawasan atau bangunan-bangunan ini adalah di lingkungan pemerintahan, beberapa memang sudah dimiliki oleh pemerintah dan tentu kita akan memberikan masukan kepada Pemda mengenai kawasan-kawasan atau bangunan-bangunan yang perlu dilestarikan dari segi arsitektur. Beberapa waktu yang lalu, kalau kita bicara Jawa Tengah, bukan hanya di Semarang aja, di Lasem kita juga kaya akan budaya ini, di Purwokerto, di Solo ada justru sangat giat sekali, dan ini memberikan masukan-masukan ini penting kepada pemerintah daerah, ini memberikan arahan-arahan atau memberikan masukan-masukan. Membantu Pemda dalam menyusun rencana tata ruang untuk keperluan pembangunan, pengembangan kawasan. Membantu Pemda dalam menentukan fungsi atau penggunaan baru bangunan-bangunan bersejarah atau bernilai arsitektur tinggi yang berfungsi sudah tidak sesuai lagi. Jadi kadang-kadang kalau kita tidak berperan langsung, tetapi kalau teman-teman di IAI selalu berusaha untuk memberikan masukan-masukan ini, sehingga diharapkan pemerintah juga peduli, tetapi kita dengan komunitas, dengan penggiat-penggiat ini akan selalu berkolaborasi untuk bagaimana menjaga, melestarikan warisan budaya itu dengan sebaik-baiknya. Kemudian memberi contoh-contoh keberhasilan proyek pemugaran. Nah, nanti saya akan berikan contoh yang ada di Semarang, itu bukan karya saya, tapi begitu banyak yang sudah dirubah, terutama di Kota Lama. Kalau Bapak Ibu sudah pernah ke Semarang, beberapa bangunan kota lama sudah berubah fungsi, dan itu sangat baik menurut saya karena dari sisi arsitekturnya tetap kita pertahankan, dari sisi arsitekturnya tetap kita jaga, tetapi fungsi dari bangunan itu bisa berubah tapi tidak meninggalkan itu semua. Nah, ini contoh-contoh, misalnya salah satu saya ambil ini bangunan Spiegel. Kalau kemarin dari waktu tahun 2018 kita mengadakan Pekan Arsitek di IAI Jawa Tengah. Ini ada bangunan Spiegel, ini sebelumnya, jadi bangunan sebelumnya. Kemudian karena upaya para arsitek, upaya dari pemilik dan pemerintahan, akhirnya bisa muncul menjadi bangunan yang bisa dipakai menjadi restoran dan bistro. Ini dulu banyak yang sudah kesini. Saya pasti tidak perlu panjang lebar, tetapi ini hasil dari kerja keras arsitek, hasil dari kerja keras owner untuk bagaimana melestarikan bangunan ini menjadi lebih berfungsi dan bermanfaat. Kemudian, Semarang Art Gallery. Ini juga pemiliknya adalah arsitek juga. Jadi waktu itu mereka beli bangunan dengan keadaan yang sudah biasa parahnya. Ini bangunan dibangun tahun 1937, kemudian sama pemiliknya dirubah menjadi art gallery dan sekarang menjadi destinasi wisata yang luar biasa di Kota Lama. Secara periodik mereka mengadakan pameran di tempat itu, dan sekarang juga lingkungannya, tata ekologinya sudah mulai ditata. Ini bersebelahan dengan bangunan Spiegel tadi, dan menurut saya ini langkah-langkah yang nyata yang bisa dilakukan kita semua sebagai orang yang peduli tentang bangunan-bangunan kuno. Kemudian yang menarik, dulu ini bangunan ex pengadilan, sekarang menjadi tempat makan, ya, restoran ikan bakar Cianjur, yang ini waktu itu IAI sempat memberikan IAI Award kepada arsiteknya karena dinilai cukup berhasil di dalam mengubah fungsi bangunan ini, tetapi secara arsitektur mereka tidak meninggalkan, tidak merusak, dan secara arsitektur sangat dipertahankan dan luar biasa. Ini memberikan nilai lebih, nilai plus buat kawasan Kota Semarang. Tadi disampaikan juga Mr. bahwa ini bangunan Gedung Jiwasraya. Di sini dulu ada lift yang pertama kali di Indonesia. Jadi ada mesin lift pertama, dan saat ini masih dirawat, tetapi meskipun tidak berfungsi. Tetapi ini menjadi tanggung jawab kita bersama ketika bangunan yang bagus dan indah ini kemudian masih bisa terjaga dengan baik. Nah, kemudian kalau saya juga memberikan, kalau wajah Kota Lama Semarang saat ini, beberapa cuplikan kita tampilkan. Ini di sepanjang jalan Suprapto. Ini adalah Spiegel tadi. Ini masih bangunan marba yang ini masih belum difungsikan. Ini dari ujung jembatan Berok, dan suasana di Kota Lama, di Kota Semarang ini menjadi benar-benar luar biasa perubahannya, dan ini banyak sekali bangunan-bangunan yang masih perlu disentuh oleh para arsitek di Jawa Tengah. Nah, ini di depan Spiegel dan di belakangnya adalah art gallery tadi. Nah, saya tidak terlalu banyak memberi contoh karena sebetulnya masih perlu peran aktif dari kita semua. Dan kalau berbicara bangunan-bangunan heritage, cagar budaya maupun warisan budaya ini, kita masih banyak sekali. Kalau kita bisa Jawa Tengah, banyak yang belum tersentuh. Nah, ini memang menjadi tanggung jawab kita sebagai arsitek-arsitek yang saat ini memiliki tugas untuk melestarikan ini. Berbagai cara akan kita lakukan dan kita tempuh. Nah, ini sebenarnya bangunan ikon di Kota Lama, Gereja Belenduk. Ini bukan lukisan, bukan ini, tapi ini hasil jepretan foto real di sana yang memang ini hasil kerja keras teman-teman. Ya, jadi kalau makin lebih banyak, mari kita berkunjung Semarang. Karena kalau kita kupas satu persatu, tentu ini nggak akan cukup waktu dan pasti Bapak Ibu, terutama yang berkecimpung di ini akan lebih tahu. Tetapi garis besarnya adalah bahwa kami sebagai Asosiasi Profesi Ikatan Arsitek Indonesia Jawa Tengah memang memikul tanggung jawab ini baik secara intern di dalam teman-teman arsitek maupun keluar ke pemerintahan. Kami selalu akan bekerja keras untuk bagaimana turut melestarikan atau menjaga warisan budaya ini dengan sepenuh hati. Mas itu rasanya tidak terlalu banyak yang ulun sampaikan karena ini menurut saya penting, tetapi kalau berbicara tentang urusan heritage dan data, tadi Pak Hab sudah menyampaikan banyak, dan teman-teman mari kita diskusi untuk ke depan seperti apa dan bagaimana, mari kita diskusi karena di sini banyak teman-teman pakar-pakar heritage yang luar biasa. Terima kasih Mas Tito. Saya kembalikan ke Mas Tito. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih kembali Mas Sugiarto. Ini sangat menarik sekali. Jadi setelah dari Pak Hab ke Mas Sugiarto, well, seems like you have many big fans here, Mr. Hab, and many questions that will be asked to you. Well, I'll start for a question from Yanti Pane from Jakarta. The question is, Mr. Hab, I am currently doing research on residential building, Stratspoor and Tramwegen, especially in Batavia. Do you have a keyword to that archive at Leiden University Library? Because I am difficult to find that archive and how to become a member of that library there. I heard a lot of data on SS there. I don't know what SSS mean, but I already asked the library staff by email, but no response. Thank you. Mr. Hab, this is your turn to answer the question. Please.
Yes, thank you. I already have seen a lot of questions in the list, so people have already sent me their questions. What we can do is to give my email address. So if people have questions, please send me an email with your question, because I will answer it in depth. And I will try to answer this very first question. Leiden University is very hard to access. The problem is you have to be a member of the university, student or member of the staff to get access to the digital thing. Sometimes they give you an access thing, an access code, sometimes not. And they have, of course, they get many questions from all over the world because their collection, the library, is such enormous. Huh? And also to access the many um, data which are in the collection of Leiden University, it's sometimes it's very hard to find your data. The question was about the stam, the tram and spoorwegen, which is the railway system. You had many systems. You had many tram and railway organizations in the colonial period. SS means Staatsspoorwegen. SS, Staatsspoorwegen. So the National Railway Company of the Dutch Indies, SS Spoorwegen. So what you could use as key term is spoorwegen. Let me spell it for you. Let me check if I can use the whiteboard. I have to write or text. Hold on. No. Let me check. How do I do this? I can do it. Sorry. Hold on.
Okay. Okay.
I can't type it. So, as I say, send me an email and I will answer. Huh? I don't know who was the question.
From Yanti Pani.
Okay, Yanti, just write me an email and I will answer. There were different questions also they asked me, and I also answered them. Please send me an email, which is huib.akihari@gmail.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ibu Estia has my email address, so she can down and also so yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Bu Yanti Pane barangkali bisa langsung kontak langsung dengan Pak Hab, mungkin bisa meminta emailnya ke Bu Esti ya. The second question, guys, you still have a question, Mr. Hab. From Heri Setiawan, Bapak Heri Setiawan Punawali, Department of Public Housing, Urban Settlement and Public Works at East Java Province, State Bau Bureau in Oost Java. Question to Mr. Hab Akihari. I have read your book, Architecture and State Bau in Indonesia. How to find more source about urban planning, urban planner and their thought about their planning. So we could know their intention, what they planned several cities. For instance, how to find source related to Karsten writing, local technique, local bilangan, etc., etc. Thank you, please.
Yeah, okay. The archive of Karsten is not yet found. That's the problem. We have their sons. He had 4 sons, and they were living in Holland, in The Hague. And I remember well, in the 1980s, I met 3 of them. One of the sons was also an architect, and he was also a teacher at the TU Delft, the technical high school. And he showed me some books of Karsten, and also his diary, which he wrote in prison in Japanese camp. It was a very small book, big size. It has very thin paper, and every inch, every millimeter was written about culture, about architecture, about his wife, Indonesian wife, about everything, but in such a small handwriting that you couldn't read. And I suppose, and I advised him, please copy that book, make a digital edition of it so that we can enlarge it and we can read the text, because this is very important. But the book isn't digitized, and 3 of the 4 sons have died already, so I don't know where the book is. I remember, because if you read my book and you check on Karsten, there are a lot of, let me check, there are a lot of publications made by Karsten, and it's on page 118 and 119. There's a lot of Karsten. He wrote in magazines like Lokale Techniek and Indisch Bouwkundig Tijdschrift. He was, let's say, writer for these magazines, which were published in the 1920s and 1930s. He wrote about everything, about buildings, about town planning, about giving advice to municipalities, stadsgemeenten. So my advice is check the list given in the book. Check the publications of Karsten. The question is now, yeah, but Lokale Techniek, I can't find it in Indonesia. That's true. Sometimes it's not clear where you can find publications. I remember in the 80s, I was at ITB in Bandung at the library, and they had a lot of volumes of Indisch Bouwkundig Tijdschrift. But 3 years ago, I was there and it wasn't there anymore. So what happened with it? So sometimes things disappear. I don't know. So what you can do is check Delver, delver.nl, which is the Dutch Royal Library. They have digitized many magazines. Also, Indisch Bouwkundig Tijdschrift. Check on Indisch Bouwkundig Tijdschrift. Check on Lokale Techniek and try to find the articles mentioned in this book. Watch your spelling, because it's very important to use the right spelling to find your data in Delver. If you can't find, perhaps they don't have anything, but more reasonable is that you haven't used the right spelling, the correct spelling. So try to find, use the word Karsten, or use things like stadsplanning, stedenbouw, etc. Terms like that. So you have to make a list, maybe I should do it, to make a list of, let's say, 50 terms, search terms, keywords you have to use when finding data. Dutch words which are many times used in the old Dutch publications. So if we are talking about town planning, tata bangunan kota, you have to use stadsontwikkeling, or you have to use Dutch word stedenbouw or stedenbouwkundige ontwikkeling. You have to know this. So yeah, maybe I should make a list. And I'm just looking at Pa Bimo Arnowo dari Bo Pa. Maybe I can, he's also from the Surakarta Heritage Society. Maybe we can make a list together so that we can help the people in order to find the right data for specific topics in your research. Could be architecture, could be town planning. Okay? Did I answer the question? Sometimes it's very hard things. You have to be very associative in your keywords. Don't give up. And sometimes you don't find anything, which is also a result knowing there is nothing. This is also true. As a researcher, sometimes you are looking for things, for data, for a couple of months, and you will find nothing. You get frustrated or not. But sometimes you hit the jackpot, and you have everything. And sometimes it is scratching the data together. Then you say, "Oh, I have to look there and there." It's like a investigation. It's like a crime investigation. You have to be like a Hercule Poirot to find your data.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Does it make you satisfied, Pak Hari? Okay. 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 The next question still for you, Mr. Hal. It came from wait. Rini Burini S. Saptaning Tias from Mataram. Please ask whether Mr. Hub also knows the history of Dutch heritage building in Mataram, Lombok. Because I want to know more about historical building in the old port of area Ampenan in the context of revitalization effort. Please, Mr. Hub.
Yeah. What you have to do is check Delphi. The problem is with remote parts within the colony. There are lots of publications, but most of the publications deal with big cities, with cities on the Isle of Java, on Sumatra, perhaps sometimes on Kalimantan, sometimes Makassar. But if you go to remote parts of Indonesia, like Mataram, like Maluku, like northern part of Sulawesi, you won't find many documentation. You won't find many data because there are no publications about this kind of architecture over there. It's a pity. Huh? So my advice is, if you want to find a few things, try Delphi. The Royal Library, try to find data or starting data, which in the magazines, in the local newspapers, which were published at that time. If you say Mataram, try to use that word in your keyword as keyword in Delphi and check Delphi. You have to start digging, really digging hard. It's not very easy. Try to find the name of a person who was at Mataram. If you are looking at your building, is there a date? Is there a sign on the building? Use that and try it as a keyword for in Delphi. Be very creative. That's you have to be very creative to find your data. So, but try to be systematic. That's all what I can advise. Sometimes it's very hard to find data, especially for those remote parts. Okay. But send me an email with your question, and I will try to help you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hub. Three questions. As answered by Mr. Hub, we still have a question for. Masih ada pertanyaan buat Pak Sugiarto ini dari Purwokerto. Pertanyaan untuk narasumber kedua. Mohon penjelasan tentang bangunan bersejarah di Purwokerto. Syukur bisa di-share bangunan-bangunan tersebut. Terima kasih dari Bu Suci Rahayu, SMA Negeri Batu Raden. Monggo, Pak Sugiarto.
Ya, terima kasih Bu Suci. Jadi di Purwokerto kebetulan kita IAI Jawa Tengah itu sudah berekspan ke sana. Artinya kita memang sedang membentuk wilayah Purwokerto. Jadi nanti ada IAI Purwokerto dan kaitan dengan bangunan-bangunan cagar budaya di Purwokerto itu sebenarnya Purwokerto sama Banyumas itu banyak juga. Kalau di Purwokerto itu ada hotel besar itu ya, hotel besar, kemudian ada kantor. Tapi secara detail memang kita ini teman-teman Purwokerto baru mendata gitu. Kemudian nanti teman-teman arsitek Purwokerto juga akan mengarah ke sana. Artinya bagaimana mengupayakan, karena kondisi saat ini bangunan-bangunan di sana memang cukup tidak terurus oleh teman-teman arsitek karena memang belum ada. Tapi kabar baiknya bahwa di Purwokerto sudah ada TACB, yang artinya nanti ke depan bersama-sama arsitek Purwokerto akan melakukan langkah-langkah untuk bagaimana menjaga dan melestarikan bangunan-bangunan cagar budaya di Purwokerto. Kalau share datanya saya belum bisa, tapi boleh nanti kalau memang ini komunikasi bisa lewat email atau lewat WA, tentu akan kami bantu share ke depan.
Oke, terima kasih banyak Pak Sugiarto. Dan untuk Bu Suci Rahayu. Well, termin kedua dibuka untuk pertanyaan, 3 pertanyaan, dan telah terpenuhi pertanyaannya. This is so fast. Audiens kita langsung berikan pertanyaan buat Mr. Akihari. Again to you. From Ria Bikantari, Universitas Hasanuddin, to Prof. Akihari, could you please explain more on interpretation techniques after description of an architectural heritage? That is the question, Mr. Ha.
Oh, that's a difficult question. How to interpret?
Yes.
It depends. It depends. First of all, your first question is important. What is your research question? What is the question you are looking for? Because that will answer. It will give a direction to the interpretation of the data. It depends also what kind of information you find. Is it what kind of source you're using? If you use a primary source, there's no interpretation. You have the bare facts of things. If you, let's say, if you're looking for a building and you say, what is the name of the architect, and you find it, there's no interpretation left, but just you have to accept this is the person I'm looking for, or this is the building with the name, or this is the year of design or construction. Simple facts which you will find. But if they are talking about, for instance, style, okay? For instance, something which they always say in Indonesia is everything built between 1910 or 1930, those 20 years, they will say, oh, it's Art Deco.
Yeah.
And this is wrong. So they say everything is Art Deco. Well, no way. Art Deco is something else. Right? Art Deco is, in the terms of Western art history, is a term used for graphical word, art decoratif, right? The way how to decorate things. And it was used in graphical manuscripts for the first time. Later on, they used it for more specific or for more general things which were related to that specific movement in art, Art Deco. Right. Right? Which you also have a few movements in art at that time, like Art Nouveau, Jugendstil, which were related to specific countries. Jugendstil is German, Austrian. Art Nouveau is French. The new art, which was in England, the Nieuwe Kunst, we call it in Holland. And they have a kind of similarity between, but they have local differences. They also have something to do which Indonesia, if you look at the buildings in Indonesia, they have a kind of embellishments and decorations. They glass, for instance, the windows, glass windows with colors, etc., etc. If buildings have those glass windows, they say, oh, it's Art Deco. That's not true. Of course, they have glass windows, but I won't call it Deco. I would say they have different word like expressionism, to express or something like that. Or it's related to the Dutch Amsterdam School, which is also coming out of movements like Jugendstil, Art Nouveau. It's very interrelated. But mentioning it Art Deco is, in my opinion, not correct. So, but we have to find out if there is a specific term, how we have to name this kind of movement which you see in Indonesia on buildings in that specific time between 1920 1930, especially in residential houses. You see a kind of abstraction of forms related with glass windows, colored glass windows with beautiful decorated doors and paneling, etc., etc. Is it Art Deco? No, but it is something else which I would say maybe we have to name it the indie style of the 20s, abstract, which was related and influenced by the Dutch Amsterdam School, which has, of course, also relations with Jugendstil, etc., etc., Art Nouveau, etc., etc. But we have to describe it, and that's not done yet, art historically speaking. So I would suggest be careful with saying everything as Art Deco in Indonesia, which is, in my opinion, not true. And this is interpretation. This is an example why you have to be careful with interpreting things. So if you read someone who says this building was built in that year and it's Art Nouveau or it's Art Deco, and everyone is, oh, he says it, so it's true. Right? So you have to be careful with taking over others' interpretation. How do you say it? Be careful. Right? You have to be, think about it. If I say something, you don't have to accept it. We can debate about it. This is interpretation. So it has to do, if you say, well, how to interpret things, sometimes it's very hard. This is my experience, because I've been in the field for many years. Sometimes you see a lot of things which has similarities, etc., etc. So there is a kind of style. It's also related to the question in the 1920s, 23, 24, about developing in architecture, in the colonial architecture, a style which was based on the Indonesian culture, more than the Dutch, more than the Western architecture. Figures like architects, for instance, Karsten and McLean-Pont and Schoenmaker discussed in magazines about how to develop a architectural style which was more related to the Indonesian culture, and which is a very important topic and an actual topic, and which is still relevant for Indonesia nowadays.
Yeah.
So it also has to do with interpretation. How do you describe certain buildings? How do you describe certain data, and how to use it? It's hard to give you advice in this. But yeah, be careful. Be careful.
Okay, thank you, crystal clear. And next question, still on you. From Budiarto Eko, Bapak Budiarto Eko Kusumo, Kekunaan, Block of Story of Indonesian Heritage Solo, Villa Liberty Building, or famous called Omah Lawa at Solo City, was a monumental colonial building in Solo, but poor information about the history of the building. How could you solve the difficulty to find a reference about it with a edition, please?
Yeah. I know this building. I was there a couple of years ago. It was still a ruin, and you couldn't go inside. But I think it was made by a Chinese family who lived in that house, as far as I'm well informed. And they also made the commission to build a house. But who the architect or the designer, I don't know. It could be a Dutch architect. It could also be a local Chinese or Indonesian architect. My advice always is, if you don't know anything about a building, try to find details in the building. Sometimes there are glass paneling in the building with the letters in the glass. Sometimes it refers to either the family or the company involved. If it's a public house or is it an office, sometimes it gives reference who was the first inhabitant of the building. Sometimes there are signs in the building which lead to the history of the building itself. And those leads you have to use to track down your data. So the building still is not known. And but as my suggestion is that someone, a Chinese family, will live there. And if that's true, we have to check the local papers and check them, of course. Check the address. Try to find the old Dutch address or the colonial address, the Jalan, the weg at that time, and use that as searching term, and so forth and so forth. Sometimes, which is also, we try to give you a way of trying to find data, metadata. For most of the monuments or objects, this can be a good way of doing things. Sometimes you are disappointed because you can't find anything. If you don't find anything, often I do think it's not made by Dutch architects. It's not made by the Dutch. It's local. It could be a local contractor, Chinese or Indonesian. So those works of those architects were not mentioned in the papers, were not mentioned in the records, unfortunately. So after so many years of research, I sometimes think if nothing is there, we don't have to find in the Dutch archives because it's not there. You have to try to find local archives, local sources. Maybe all the people who lived near the place could tell you something. Try to find locals who know more about the building, and maybe they can suggest names, or maybe, hey, this family lived there. Then track the family, trace the family down. Try to find it this way. Sometimes very hard and very time consuming, of course. Yeah? But if you're local authority or local organizations, you can do it. But that's another way. Right? By just use your personal info of people who lived close by and track them down in order to find some data or leads, information which you can use to go back to your online databases. It's sometimes very time consuming. So it's not the way. It's not my way of doing research is not always guarantees no results. Not always. So that's a little frustrating. I know.
Oke, Bapak-Bapak, Ibu-Ibu, waktu kita hanya tinggal 7 menit lagi. Untuk sesi tanya jawab sudah selesai. Jadi maafkan saya kalau ada pertanyaan yang masih belum bisa disampaikan ke narasumber. Okay, before we close this seminar, Mr. Hart, would you like to give a closing statement related to this seminar? We could learn from this seminar better then, please.
Well, I would like to thank you all for your kind attention and be part of this early morning session for me. I hope to be back very soon in Indonesia, but due to the coronavirus, Indonesia is closed for tourists. I was planning to come to Indonesia in October again to have some workshops and a congress in Pontianak, but everything was postponed. So I also hope to see you back next year because you have invited me or the university to do a workshop about mencari data. So it's a 2-day workshop, and then I will explain in depth how you could find data which will help you in your research for your heritage projects, which is hopefully will stimulate you, will make you enthusiastic about doing research in this field of topic, heritage, bangunan kolonial, but also in other fields of study and other disciplines. You can use the method how to find data online using a kind of method which is will help you to find data more easily. I also would suggest if you would like to start making inventories or doing research, be patient, don't give up, and try everything to find your data and talk with people. Maybe others can help you in finding data. My experience is when I do the workshop, we have always a few case studies, local case studies. I always ask the people, what is your problem? Which buildings give you problem in finding data? Let's make them the case study. And 5 or 6 people are working on a specific case study, using the methods described in the toolkit, mencari data, and then they have to find data. Go online, but they discuss together in how to look, how to use, which kind of terms, which kind of sources they have to use, and if they find something, how they have to interpret those data. And finally, they have to present it for the whole group. And I must say that I'm always very surprised by the results. They really find many things because they use their methods, but also they work together. And this is also my advice for local people. If you are looking for data, you can call me, you can email me, but also try to find others and talk about it together in order to find ways of finding your data. Work together, exchange experiences and learn from each other because that's important. Jangan malu, just ask because that's important. It will bring you to take those steps in your research. Don't give up. Go and go and go. Try to find. That's my advice.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience through this seminar. The next closing statement might be came from Pak Sugiarto. Mohon closing statement Pak Sugiarto, please.
Baik, terima kasih. Pertama-tama saya senang bisa kenal Pak Mr. Hub. Halo Mr. Hub.
Hype. Mr. Hype.
Yang kedua, dari beberapa pertanyaan sempat jawab melalui chat, yang intinya adalah ada banyak kekhawatiran ketika nanti di generasi milenial tidak terlalu peduli dengan warisan budaya kita. Nah, ini mesti kita bergandeng tangan untuk bagaimana nanti mengajak teman-teman muda ini untuk bisa tadi yang saya sampaikan bahwa mencintai, memahami, bahkan mau untuk peduli dengan warisan budaya kita ini sangat penting. Jadi tentu banyak cara-cara, banyak langkah-langkah yang kita bisa lakukan, bisa kerjakan untuk bagaimana mempengaruhi, dan pasti kalau yang sudah berkecimpung sudah fokus, bela fokus, tapi tugas kita juga mengajak rekan-rekan yang muda untuk juga tertarik dan bisa peduli dengan tahun-tahun ini. Makanya kegiatan-kegiatan seminar seperti ini sangat penting, dan saya yakin ada manfaat yang luar biasa untuk bagaimana kita semuanya merasa memiliki tanggung jawab untuk menjaga dan melestarikan warisan budaya kita. Terima kasih Mas Ito.
Merdeka. Oke, terima kasih Mas Sugiarto atas closing statement-nya. Well, beberapa keywords yang bisa kita ambil adalah pada saat mencari data, kalau susah keywords-nya adalah email Pak Hype. Email Pak Hype aja, by Bu Esti Susanti. Dan jangan membuang waktu dengan terlalu banyak mencari, di mana pada referensi yang sudah dibukukan itu tidak ada. Itu akan membuang-buang waktu. Keywordnya dari Pak Sugiarto adalah stay sebagai generasi muda. Oke, terima kasih waktunya semuanya. Waktunya seminar telah selesai, maka waktu saya kembalikan ke Bu Esti Susanti. Silahkan Bu Esti.
Ya, terima kasih Bapak Ibu, saudara-saudara sekalian, Pak Hab, Pak Sugiarto, Mas Tito, dan co-host bahwa seminar pemanasan tentang heritage baru kita mulai. Ini adalah perjalanan yang panjang, menyangkut interdisiplin, multidisiplin. Hari ini tekanannya pada isu arsitektur. Nah, kita punya 2 undang-undang, ternyata Undang-Undang Nomor 6 Tahun 2017 soal arsitektur juga membahas soal heritage, tentu dari segi fisik. Melakukan renovasi, rehabilitasi dan sebagainya, ternyata ada aturannya, teman-teman sekalian, dan bisa merujuk pada undang-undang itu, tidak boleh sembarangan dirubah, tidak boleh dirobohkan. Kalau mau diperbaiki harus ada aturannya. Jadi itu bagian dari satu proses yang telah kita lalui. Lalu kita juga punya undang-undang pemajuan kebudayaan tahun 2017 yang juga di situ mencakup isu heritage yang non bendawi, pemikiran, alih fungsi dan sebagainya, itu bagian dari heritage kita. Karena itu saya kira juga hukum juga masuk ke dalam ranah ini. Ini adalah satu perjalanan panjang. Mari kita saling mendukung, saling bersinergis untuk melestarikan cagar budaya dalam bentuk heritage ini. Sebetulnya kalau tidak ada COVID, akhir tahun ini bersama Pak Hap itu Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana merencanakan untuk melakukan lokakarya, bagaimana cara mengakses data-data yang ada di Belanda yang tersedia secara online, supaya kalau kita menuliskan tentang heritage yang ada itu berdasarkan data, bukan berdasarkan interpretasi. Yang kalau dalam kalangan orang sejarah disebut data primer. Saya kira itu ini adalah satu perjalanan awal, dan di sini ada pimpinan Surakarta Heritage Society, partner dalam kolaborasi menyelenggarakan 75 tahun kemerdekaan. Mas Yunanto mau memberikan statement?
Saya kira tidak, Bu Esti, saya kira sudah cukup.
Oh ya, saya kira itu karena kita di kalangan komunitas, LSM, pemerintah, perguruan tinggi, juga jaringan internasional seperti Pak Hap, saya kira kita perlu bergandengan tangan untuk dasar memori kolektif yang terkait dengan peradaban kita. Saya kira itu, terima kasih atas kehadiran Bapak Ibu, kawan-kawan sekalian. Mohon maaf kalau saya kaku karena kenalnya itu saya tadi lihat kok sedikit banget gitu. Jadi rada grogi. Sebelum kita tutup, kita foto bersama dan materinya bisa diakses dari Pak Hap maupun dari Pak Sugiarto. Nanti akan saya lampirkan di WA, termasuk sertifikat dan sebagainya. Jadi urusan-urusan yang belum selesai bisa kita selesaikan di WA dan bisa berhubungan langsung dengan Pak Hap. Mari kita foto bersama. Silakan operator untuk tanda bukti bahwa seminar ini berlangsung.
Mohon teman-teman untuk menyalakan video.
Ya, baik Bapak Ibu, saya akan mengambil foto. Di layar saya terdapat 3 slide, jadi saya akan mengambilkan slide pertama, dimulai dari sekarang. Nanti akan saya menghitung pengambilan fotonya. 1, 2, 3. Oke, bentar ya, slide kedua. Oke, untuk slide yang kedua, saya hitung. Masih ada beberapa rekan-rekan yang belum menyalakan videonya, mohon menyalakan videonya terlebih dahulu. Terima kasih. Mungkin ada kendala gangguan jaringan, maka saya langsung ambil saja. Karena memang beberapa banyak ini di sini tidak terlihat videonya. Oke. Sudah ya, saya hitung mundur untuk pengambilan fotonya. 3, 2, 1. Oke. Untuk slide yang ketiga. Slide yang ketiga, videonya mohon dibuka, Bapak Ibu, ditampilkan. Di layar saya belum ada yang menampilkan video. Oke, bisa dinyalakan videonya, rekan-rekan sekalian. Baiklah, saya hitung mundur untuk slide yang ketiga. 3, 2, 1. Terima kasih Ibu, saya kembalikan ke Ibu.
Ya, siapa? Herman, kayaknya Pak Momi masuk. Jadi Pak Momi adalah rekan Ketua Himpunan Kerabat Mangkunegaran. Sudah masuk. Ya.
Belum masuk, Ibu.
Oh, tadi saya lihat dia mau masuk karena tadi pada potret, tapi karena sudah selesai salah paham soal waktu saya kira. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu sekalian atas kehadiran Bapak Ibu sekalian, dan mohon untuk mengisi lembar evaluasi dan seminar kita yang akan datang berlangsung 11 September hari Jumat di pukul 9 pagi sampai 11 pagi waktu Indonesia Barat dengan pembicara Profesor Peter Carey, seorang sejarawan dari Oxford, dan juga Pak Neil Rukidara dan Ibu Nina Tanjung dengan moderator Ibu Linda. Temanya adalah heritage sebagai DNA bangsa. Jadi ini lebih soal non-bendawi dan bendawi saya kira. Silakan kalau bagi Bapak Ibu sekalian dan saudara-saudara sekalian kalau mau mendaftar. Terima kasih atas partisipasinya. Semoga heritage bisa semakin maju kita tangani bersama. Terima kasih.